Very great honor to welcome to Harvard University tonight the former President of the Republic of France, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. One of the statesmen of our era and a leader not only of France, but of Europe and indeed of the late 20th century world, President Giscard led the Fifth Republic through the difficult years 1974 to 1981. His tenure began immediately after the oil shock of 1973 and Henry Kissinger's ill-fated Year of Europe. It continued through a decade in which most of the advanced industrial economies grew slowly, and some, like our own, not at all, and suffered high unemployment and high inflation. Soviet military power increased relentlessly during this period, creating a substantial imbalance in Europe. And what about France under President Giscard's leadership? Under his leadership, France emerged both militarily strong and economically competitive, a combination of objectives that have so far eluded policy in the United States. Among European powers, France alone has been exempt from that emergent pacifism or neutralism that has arisen elsewhere. And French economic performance during this period was so remarkable that Herman Kahn, the notorious American futurologist, published a book in which he predicted that before the 1990s, France would have overtaken Germany in gross national product. Given Herman Kahn's track record as a predictor, this led me to begin to worry about France. Indeed, I think, as many of you know, Herman Kahn has proved to be a weather vane that typically points precisely in the wrong direction. And with the election of Mitterrand, France has come to fit into that pattern as the French economic performance has plummeted. Mr. President is... Welcome to Harvard, yes. As you know, the relationship between Harvard and France goes back many years, in fact, back to the period before the French Revolution. As I was commenting to Charlie Adams, who's here tonight, if you look at the revolutionaries of that time, Sam Adams, John Hancock, John Adams, they received not only inspiration, but substantial aid from France. In fact, it was John Adams, who was a graduate of the class of 1755 at Harvard, who served alongside Benjamin Franklin as the joint commissioner to France in 1776 and who arranged the alliance in which France came into that war against Britain in behalf of the United States. President Giscard has continued this tradition of good relations and friendship in the modern era, and in fact, his brother is a graduate of Harvard Business School. President Giscard was educated at an institution with which some of us here sometimes compare Harvard's John F. Kennedy School of Government, ENA, E-N-A, the École Nationale d'Administration. He began his political career by winning a seat in the National Assembly held by his grandfather. He served as the Minister of Finance under President Charles de Gaulle and later under President Pompidou. A vital force in French politics today, a leader with a respected record and a strong following, we know that his voice will continue to be heard in France, in the United States, and in fact in all countries of the world. Mr. President, you greatly honor Harvard by being here tonight, and we welcome you as our Pollock Lecturer for 1983. Thank you.
Ladies, Mrs. and gentlemen, I'm very honored to be tonight the guest of the Kennedy School of Government for this Pollock lecture. I will do my best to try to speak to you and also to be understood by you. I suppose it's better for me to speak in an easy and informal way, and I will try to explain a little later why. First, Dean. This is the proper title. You are a rather young Dean, but I enjoy calling you Dean. Then I thank you for the description of my career. It's very interesting to be presented by others because you have only qualities, successes, and the failures and shortcomings are left into the shadows. May I say, before speaking to you, that the reason for which I willingly accepted to come here is the memory of the President Kennedy, whose your institutions were the name. I see a painting of him, and for the youngest of you, I will evoke a few memories. It's always difficult to imagine how was a time of the past. There's always a kind of golden light which illuminates the past. But in this case, it was true. When the United States elected in the 60s, the youngest president of their history, in a world which was starting to change, to look for new values, new attitudes, it was perceived in the world like a kind of blessing. And it's certainly difficult for you to imagine that now what was the reputation, inspiration that the President Kennedy brought to the American policies abroad. I will mention three personal memories. First, his assassination. I was then Minister for Finance, and I was going to dinner in the western suburbs of Paris. It was a quiet evening with beautiful weather for the season, and the streets were normally animated in the evening because of the change of time between us. And I was only with my chauffeur of the ministry, and as usually, I was driving. And he was not frightened. And we were going along the streets, and around 8:30, something happened. We couldn't know what. The streets became quieter, empty, and there was a strange feeling everywhere. And there was a red light at a crossing. We stopped, and one man came and said to us, President Kennedy has been assassinated. And this event, which could have been only an American event, or an American emotion, was a worldwide emotion. And for the rest of the evening in Paris, which is, many of you know our capital, which is a living town, with a kind of excitement, all that, it was a moved city for a few hours. I remember very well that I came to, the first time I met him, I was junior minister. And we decided to repay in advance the remains of our war debt. We were succeeding at the time to increase our external reserves, and a normal use for these reserves was to repay our debts. So the government, under de Gaulle, instructed me to go to Washington to repay for the last of the debt. And I was carrying with me the largest check I ever had, which was, I don't remember, $130 million. And very kindly, President Kennedy suggested that I come to see him, because it was an important gesture for the French-American friendship. So I went to the White House. I was received by him, and we spoke for half an hour. And the very curious attitude of him was, at the end, to ask for my advice. He said to me, you know, we have difficult problems for our external monetary relations, and you seem to succeed. So if you were here, what would you do? What would you suggest me to do? And so I was younger than the dean, and the President of the United States had the quality of simplicity of asking me for my advice and suggestion, which was, I think, a good illustration of his attitude. And another time in Paris, we spoke about his future, because you have a law that limits to 2 terms, the possibility of for a president to run. And we spoke about it, and he said to me, well, if I serve 2 terms, after that, what will interest me will be to enter into the publishing business. Because I think that when you have been a politician, when you have been a political leader, what is important is to try to convey to the people the beliefs, the experience, the observations you made. So it's what I'm trying to do now. I'm invited for what is called a Polak lecture. This lecture has been created now, I suppose, about 30 years ago. And the first lecturer was a very remarkable man. It was Robert Schuman, who was the founder, really, of the European community. And so I'm very honored, first, to be before you, and also to speak at the same rostrum, not in the same place, probably, as Robert Schuman. It is supposed to be a lecture. I mean, I'm supposed to read you a text written in advance, and probably by some aides of mine. I thought that it would be more interesting, perhaps more interesting for you and more pleasant for me to have a conversation. Because if I have something to bring to you, it's not the formal conclusions of the numerous and very brilliant experts who worked for me. It is rather my own experience, what I felt, what I remember, what I experienced. And this will probably come out through a conversation more than through a lecture. So, Dean Allison, it will be the first Polak conversation. My topic is the new patterns of democracies. Why? It's because through what I experienced, my election, my no re-election, the problems I had with the people, with the communications, with intellectual people, I really perceived that there are new patterns for democracies, that the way to rule, to govern democracies are certainly changing. Everything is changing, so the way to govern democracies is probably also changing. And I tried to look through the work I'm doing now, which is the work of research and findings, to look for what are the adequate ways for ruling democracies in this changing world. So my suggestion tonight will be first comments on this and 2 major applications. One will be for Europe and perhaps one for the, if we have time, for the international monetary system. The 3 functions of the new democratic leaders, I mean the elected President of the United States or the elected President of France or the Chancellor of West Germany or the Prime Minister of Great Britain. these functions are three functions: to listen, to decide, and to communicate. And all these functions are rather difficult for specific reasons. I will comment on these three functions. First, to listen. When I go to meet some French people now, they said to me, "Oh, you haven't listened enough to us," which is curious because I did. But if they say so, it's because they have a basic demand to be listened to. Before my first campaign, I made a speech that became famous because I won. If I've lost, the speech would not have become famous at all. And I said, I will try during my campaign to look into the eyes of France, to see what she thinks, what she feels. So my first attitude was to look. And I think now that the modern attitude is to listen. So the next campaign for the next candidate will not be to look into the eyes, but to listen to the people. Why? It's because we are living in a time of change. And people want you to understand their desire for change. What is really this desire of change? I will dedicate rather lengthy remarks on that because I think it's the crucial element. In recent years, I will not speak about the United States. I have not sufficient knowledge of this. A kind of fragmentation of our traditional society has taken place. There is at the same time contradictory phenomenon. There is a quest for new individual liberties, and in the same time a reference to the past, what you call here, for instance, the roots phenomenon. The young are bringing into the public debate some new themes, for instance, environment, human rights, truth and morality in public life. One of my accomplishments I'm very proud of is the fact to have lowered the voting age in France from 21 to 18. Probably I assured my defeat. Probably, because if you take, we have about 600,000 new voters a year, so it's 1,600,000. And probably 2/3 of them, 3/5, voted for my opponents, and the margin was inferior to this. But I think anyway that this was a major achievement. May I quote you for a souvenir with de Gaulle? With Anemone, who is seated there, we were invited by de Gaulle one day for a kind of social lunch. Because de Gaulle, probably under the guidance of the protocol service or the public relations people, I don't know, decided that he should give some social receptions. And there is in France, like in the United States, a setting at the table, and since I was minister, Anemone was seated near de Gaulle. And this is just, de Gaulle was always asking her, after each course, how many children have you? And since the number of children haven't changed between the first course and the second, she always answered 4. But there was also a general. And this general was trying to make some kind of small talk. And he said to de Gaulle, Mon général, because it was the way to address him, Mon général, in what you did, I always supported all what you did. But with the exception of one thing. Why did you give the voting right to women? And de Gaulle was a very witty person, took a kind of thinking attitude, dreaming. I said, well, it's a very interesting question. And, well, I'm asking myself for the answer, but perhaps it's a mistake. But I'm afraid I did a worse mistake. It's when I gave the right of vote to the military people. I was just mentioning that we reduced the voting age to 18 in France. And the French citizen, who traditionally has had only two dimensions, his work, his job, and his multi-generation family, is more and more a part of a diversified network of associations, unions, groups, through which he develops his aspiration for culture, information, sport, even now travel. New structures have appeared with the rapid evolution of our educational system and the emergence of a new types of family relations. Women are playing an ever-growing role in the workforce and in the political debate. If you watch the local elections now, there's almost always a woman being candidate. And when one looks at the various tendencies present in different measures across the borders of Europe, four fundamental trends emerge. And these trends, I will not try to look, I will not be too pedant on this, but I think it's important to know them because they have shaped, or they're shaping a new European society. The first feature is a move toward autonomy and informality. When I was elected, there was still what we call mimetism. People try to resemble the people having success. My first prime minister tried to speak as I did and to wear the ties I was wearing. It was normal at the time. And during my term, mimetism almost disappeared. If you look at the way like the young girls are dressing themselves, in France, for instance, when you went into the streets, you have about 4 million of Brigitte Bardot because they were dressing, doing their hair, and exactly like she did. And if you go now, you will not see two people similar because there is a desire for identification, for autonomy. The quest for personal expression, which is very curious, the desire to speak for oneself, which was limited 10 years ago, is now very strong. And it's the reason for which people say, you should have listened to me. This quest is also the quest of the rejection of authority and social constraints, and these forces are still fundamental. But what is curious is in the last 3 or 4 years, one detects a more open attitude, rejecting the most radical stance and accepting some kind of modernized leadership. And so for the future democratic leaders, they must not try to recapture the ancient kind of leadership because they will fail. They must try to identify themselves to this new kind of leadership, and I will speak about it. It's a leadership in which you help solutions to come out, in which you put yourself at the crossroads of trends and of attitudes to try to be a kind of cybernetical leader. I don't know if this is translatable in English. Yes, in which you use the mechanism of the society to find the solution, and not in which you indicate yourself what the solution should be. And this is very interesting because it has practical implications. In the first years of my term, television was an asset for me. In the last 2 years, it was a liability. And I didn't know why. No one told me why. Said to me, well, just after my failure. And it was for this, because of this trend. During the beginning, the social evolution was such that people were accepting guidance. My explanations were judged as being good. I explained to them what they should do, and they were interested and globally satisfied. And when I met them, they always told me, you know, we are very happy because when you speak, we understand what you say, and we make us understand. You make us feeling intelligent. Doing the same thing, at the end, it played against me because people wanted to decide by themselves and to have a too indicative attitude, to try to force their judgment was resented as a kind of constraint. So you see that these cultural changes are not abstract, they're very practical in the relationship between the leader and the people. Second feature, there are only 4, you must not be afraid of that. Second feature is a move toward intuition and emotion, with the decline of moralism or rationalism, and more broadly of ideologies in general. And this trend is very strong. For instance, the decline of moralism. If you take the history of moralism in our societies, you will find in hedonist societies around the 60s, people wanted to be happy, and what was important for them was the quest of happiness. And after that, they relaxed a little, and they wanted to have a happy society, but not such an intense quest. And in France, the decline of moralism was also the decline of what we call Manichaeism, the fact that people are classified in good and bad, and black and white, and all this. There was a sharp decline. And the reason for which, for instance, the peace movement or the neutralism in France was not very important, it was because of this trend. Because people thought, well, they are telling that they are the moral people, they know the truth on this. It cannot be true. We do not believe that there are good people on one side and wrong on the other. We should prefer to have a more pragmatic attitude. The same movement is a development of the femininity values. Because at the moment, what is happening in our societies is the fact that the values of feminities are growing much more rapidly than the values of the males. For instance, introspection, intuition, a kind of practical sense in dealing with problems, emotion, are growing faster than the rational attitude. So the presence of the femininity in our societies is not the fact that there are more women having functions. It's also the fact that the values of the society are becoming more involved with femininity itself. Third feature, a move toward a new modernity, which started with a rejection of a society dominated by consumption, the events of the 68s, and also of a society manipulated by the medias and advertising. A rejection of this, and which is evolving in the direction of a new realism. 2 indications about this. We are very curious. One is, for instance, the fact that for me, I thought wrongly that to have the reputation to be intelligent was not an asset for me. At the beginning it was. And then later people thought he's too clever. And so when he speaks, he's trying to make some tricks to influence us. And so they prefer people being supposed to be less intelligent, but, and they have the choice, but they but in which they do not fear the manipulation. And as you know, the fear, the procès d'intention, I don't know if you say this in English, are basic features in the social relationship of today. Another example which is very, very strange of this, everyone believed in France and probably in the United States that there was a growing desire for the nature, for the forests, for the rivers, for the wilderness, for the animals. There was a retornment of this since 76. The desire for nature is now diminishing. Curiously, if you put an advertisement with a mountain, some lakes, some ice-capped peaks, it will have no success. Because people are moving towards a kind of approximate modernity, and the nature is too far from them. So if you show a garden, a few flowers, a pet animal, you will touch them. And so it showed that the sphere of the human interest is probably concentrating. The last feature is a move towards complexity and uncertainty, which is the recognition of the complicated and integrated world to which all our societies belong. And this movement has been supplemented by technological changes in the gathering and the transmission of information, because the modern medias add to our societies the new dimensions of instant information, instant emotion, permanent dialogue, and added selectivity in choices. Two examples for this, to show you that it's not abstract. When I was elected, I made press conferences. And in the second one, I said one of our role is to try to govern what is imprevisible. Is that understandable? It's unprevisible and understandable. It's what I said. And I have been criticized by a prominent French politician, saying it's ridiculous for a president to say so. Everything should be predictable. You cannot lead a country if you don't know what will happen 3 years in advance, 5 years in advance. And he was supported by part of the opinion. And recently, the poor man was a member of the actual government, and he was expelled from the government, which showed that he was not able for himself to govern the imprevisible. But now, if you take the other stand, if you take, I know what will happen, I will suggest simple solutions to get out of the crisis, you will not be believed. So there was a deep change in the attitude of people. Also, there is a curious fact. We entered into the crisis in 74, the end of 73, 74. I was elected in 74 in the spring because of the sudden death of the former French president. And we went into the crisis, and we had rather little political consequences of the crisis. We had increased unemployment, we have very high inflation because of the rise of the price of oil, and little political dissatisfaction. Why? And we realized after that it was because what really people wanted at that time, what was, I call, their need for personal expression. And they were not so concerned with the economic satisfactions. So since they were getting some reward for their personal expression, they put the effect of the crisis behind. And we were immune for 18 months of the political consequences of the crisis because people were concerned not by this, but by something else. And all what I'm telling you is not my judgment. It is studies because I am working with a team of people who are making studies, deep searching studies, and not through polling, because polling are very deceptive, but by what you know as being lasting interviews, to stay hours with people and let them speak, because what they say is very different of the question you would ask them. And something very, very strange in all this period, what we call the need for economic security, which is the fact that a person, a man or a woman, is confident that in the month to come he will have a job, rather well paid, and with the normal satisfaction attached to economic activity. The importance given to this is diminishing in France. If you had to make a good sense judgment, you would say the opposite. No, because other values are taking the place of this. And is the reason for which, for instance, the present administration is criticized not for its economic achievements, which you are able to judge by what you know of them, but it is criticized for other values. That is, for instance, the lack of diversification and pluralism on the TV, or the fact that there was an intention to restrain the freedom for parents to choose the school for their children, or recently, for instance, in the last measures to restrain the freedom for people to travel. So basically, in European society, what I would call the social values, the cultural values, are probably being more important to people than the classical economic and social values. What I would say to you also is that this change, because I'm speaking about listening to the society, to the changers, these change are spreading themselves into the full society. And it's very curious to see that, for instance, who is ahead of the change? The young, the people living in big cities, the most affluent people, the best educated. They are ahead of the change. But if you take the movement, the speed of the evolution, the speed is higher in other categories. And so these groups are ahead, but if you take the difference between, for instance, 74 and 81, the progress for the change in France are the working people, the workers in factories, the men and women aged between 50 and 64, the women working at home, and the retired people. They evaluated faster than the others. So instead of having what we call a radical change, in which the extremes of the society moves faster than the center, we have the opposite. It is the extreme who are moving toward the center, the aging people, the workers, the women alone, and all this. And it's very strange, for instance, if you take classical sociological examples, like, for instance, the case of, I will quote you just 2 or 3 figures for that, what we call a sexual liberalism, which is not what people are doing because we don't know, but how people judge their freedom. The sexual liberalism in France between 74 and 81, the number of people telling that they feel they are more liberated increased by 17%. That is 8,500,000. So quite a change. And the number is higher in the categories I mentioned, the farmers, the workers of the factories, and the people between 40 and 50 years. So it's not the youth who are head of the movement, but now the real movement is coming from the other classes. Another curious feature, if you ask people in France, what do you think of the society? they are against. But if you ask them, what do you think of your job? There are 9% of people in 81, more than in 74, telling you I'm pleased with it. So 9% means about 5 million people. So 5 million people more than when you ask them what they really think of what is the job, they are satisfied. So you see, it's not the movement towards a radicalization. It is the contrary. It is a very deep change, which certainly will create a society which will differ from the society we knew 10 or 20 years ago, but which will be more united, or at least with less differences. We did last year 359 interviews, lasting more than 6 hours. And out of them, only 4% expressed a feeling of radicalization. These were the aspects of the change, to listen to this. Why is it important? It is that if you don't understand what are the changes in your society, these changes will go out of the democratic structure, as it did, for instance, in the 78 in the universities, as they did lately through movements like demonstrations, the marches for peace, or their perversion through direct action like terrorism. The way to avoid this evolution is to listen, to understand what really is moving into your society, to be able to act accordingly, or at least when knowing what is happening. So the ability to listen to the ongoing change might well become the fundamental characteristic of a political leadership in modern democracies. The second aspect is to decide. Because when you think of a political leader, really a political leader is an instrument to decide. When you are a teacher or a journalist or a writer, your function is to comment, is to judge, but you haven't to decide. And when you read to the best, I hope I will not offend anyone here, but the works of the best commentators, they are very good for the first 3 quarters and weak at the end because they don't like to support a decision. But when you are in power, what you have to do is to decide. You have no choice. At the end, you must say yes or no, I will do this or not. And decision is always a difficult process. It is becoming more and more difficult for a cause that I just mentioned. It's that we are watching the emergence of what I would call democracy in real time, under which the event, the reaction to the event, the decision-making process, the decisions to implement, the reactions to the decisions of various groups are simultaneously transmitted to the citizen and assessed by him. Before, you had the delegated democracy, in which people voted for you, and they more or less implied that in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, they will judge you and decide if they will accept you for the leader of a new period. But now not. They will judge you day by day. They will support you for the East-West trade and be against you for the arms control and for the handling of the Central America crisis, for instance, day by day. And so the decision must take into account the fact that the reactions are not delayed reactions, but are almost simultaneous decisions. And it might well be that our present democratic practices are not fully consistent with this evolution. At a time at which, when the society has to be conducted by flexibility, and this is my main one of my main themes, by a series of mutually reinforcing impulses given without delay. The discontinuities which are inherent in the election process might appear to the historians of the future as an anomaly. The fact that you will have to stop very important processes of the American policy in the year to come. You will probably have to stop your action in some part of the world, of major programs you are engaged to, because the election process will begin and will stop the possibilities of taking major decisions, might appear to the historian of the future like an anomaly. Hence the need perceived in many democracies, in yours and ours, to try to engage a bipartisan dialogue with long-term issues when long-term issues are collectively assessed. I will just say at the end of this point that when you look at this, you have two consequences to draw. One is to examine very carefully the question of the sequence of the election, of the normal time for a political leader to be chosen or elected, time which is too long in France, for instance, and might be judged perhaps too brief here. And this is certainly a major question which is out of the politician approach. What is in this time in which you should not interrupt the process for too long periods? What is the proper length, proper duration of the functions? Also, the suggestion that instead of having the kind of Napoleonic approach, which is to direct from the center all the actions, all the major decisions, to try to use a kind of auto-regulating system for many decisions, to try to have into the society a kind of cybernetical ecosystem which will handle a lot of problems, which will better be solved and adjusted by such process. I envisage to speak to you in my lecture, but not in my conversation, about the need to approach the long-term issue. This is a real serious difficulty for the modern government, because the timetable of the voters, of the administration, and of the president are not the same. I can tell you, when I was, for instance, president, I was only thinking in a duration between 18 months and 5 years. And all what happened before was of little concern of mine. And the voters in France are mostly concerned about what will happen in the next 3 months. When you make studies, questions on that, you see that the judgment of people is centered into a, let's say, a 3 month to 6 month period. And if you are a modern leader, you cannot satisfy you with this, because all the decisions you take, for instance, macroeconomic policies, 18 months to 2 years to have the first results. Planning for a major new weaponry, 10 to 15 years. When you decide to build a new weapon system, you will have the system in 10 to 15 years. If you decide to restructure a major industry, or to help to the restructuring, 5 years. So there is a contradiction between the feeling of time by the voters and the feeling of time by the leaders, and this creates a difficult difference in the use of the time element. So I just mentioned this because you have problems here, for instance, employment, energy and natural resources, innovation and capital formation, that are long-term problems. No one can do anything, for instance, in the next 2 years. It's impossible, technically impossible. And anyway, you will take very important political decisions in a 2-year period. So what is the conciliations between these two needs? The last point is to communicate. And the political leader must finally be able to communicate, which means to deliver his own message, not only to a small groups of individuals or political leaders or intermediaries, but to each individual citizen. And this individual citizen is not listening. As you know, I don't know if it's the same in the United States, but we studied this. The average French citizen receives about 10% of the messages sent to him, and is selected by the time, by his own taste, by the working hours he has, the 10% he chooses. So when you speak to people, when I speak to people, I know that they will receive 1/10 of what I say, and I don't know 1/10. Which one? Because I don't know. So you must be good for 10/10, or try to be. And this function to communicate is itself complex, diversified, and evolutionary. And these functions now dominate the procedures of selection of political leaders, who are more and more judged according to a double standard, with different criteria. One is the ability to conduct the society through difficult changes in a way which is consistent with the fundamental interests of the country. This is the first criteria. But the other is the ability to communicate to the citizens the goals to be reached and the path to follow to reach these goals. This double judgment must be accepted. It's impossible for a modern leader in any country, in a democratic country, to be good if he's a good leader if he's not able to communicate. Perhaps it's unfair. You have a lot of people in the past who have been good leaders and who couldn't be now. I will quote example in France. We had a very good leader, which was Poincaré, who re-established the French economy in the 20s. He was totally unable to communicate. He couldn't appear on a TV screen. He was so boring. He could only speak for hours with very long sentences. It's impossible. He couldn't be president now. We had a very good interior minister, which was killed by the German in 40. The best probably we had. And he was a very shy man. He just spoke once in the National Assembly, and he was booed by all the members because he was so bad. And when he went down, he said, I will never go back again. It's an experience for which I will not go back again. He couldn't be a minister. No, it's impossible. So we must accept that to be a leader is to have the double ability to govern and to communicate. And probably for you think that this is not fair. Why two abilities? But in history, you had a lot of situations in which double abilities were required from people. For instance, in the old times, you had to have the ability to be a good battleman, to win military victories, and to govern. Caesar was a good general and a good political leader. Alexander also, Napoleon also. And if Caesar has been a weak general, he would have governed Rome. So it's normal at certain times to have double abilities. If you take the Pope, for instance, under the Middle Age, the popes were the head of the church, and they were also the head of the papal states, and they should have the double ability to do so. So we must accept this. The modern leaders will be people able to govern and able to communicate. And so they must train themselves for that. And they must accept this double standard. The communication is not only a question of words to be transmitted. It's also a question of acts and decisions which are perceived as symbols of the direction in which our societies have to engage themselves. Because communication now, as you know, and certainly it is taught here, it is more a question of the right side of the brain than the left side. All the logical side of the brain are centered in the left side. And what we called communication was to persuade people through logics. But now to persuade people, you must use your right side. That is the emotion, the symbols, the words. And it's very important to realize that it's the best way to communicate. If you take the churches in the past, they used miracles. Why? Because it was a way to convince people which were more emotional and more demonstrative than the logics behind. And so the use of symbols, the use of gestures, the styles will certainly be very important features for the future leaders. There is a risk. The risk is that leaders will be chosen in the future more for their ability to communicate than for their ability to govern. And this is very important risk. Because whatever we do, the importance of the image on the TV is so much powerful, so more emotional than any reasoning you can conduct, that probably the importance given to the communication will excess the just proportion for this. And the only answer is to have a diversification and a multiplication of the communication to avoid to concentrate the communication on a single element. To illustrate this briefly, because now we are approaching the end of this conversation, that the leaders, the modern leaders, taken into these contradictions are to think in longer term and to be judged on accomplishment in short terms, to be able to communicate and to be able also to govern and to find solutions, must be able to have a strategic view of their action. What is probably most disturbing in the world of today is the fact that we have a feeling that there is no clear concept of where should go the world. You have leaders who are able or less, but who are able or less for the day-to-day life. And we don't know, and the people don't know what is the kind of world, kind of society, kind of structure really they are trying to achieve. So we need to have strategic views for the future. And I will just mention one. I should have prepared two mentions, but the next will be for the next invitation of Dean Addison, which is to have a new start for Western Europe. The accomplishment of Western Europe, the union of Western Europe, is not just an administrative venture. It's something which really is an answer to some of the basic aspirations we may have. Or next year we have an election, 84. This election could be wasted if it's just a political game between parties and like this. But it might be an occasion to express the desire to move towards a more united Europe. And I hope that this occasion will be taken and that we will engage in a nouvelle étape of the Union of Europe. And since Robert Schuman was the first to speak, I hope that my memory will be remembered as much as him. What could we do for that? We had a very strong movement towards Europe 5 to 10 years ago. We created the European Council. We created the European Monetary System. We had the first election of the European Parliament by popular vote. And since nothing, it's emerging, it's coming. So we must create a new move. And this move should be envisaged through the next election. What could be the aims? First, to have more unification of the fundamental economic sectors. We have a kind of free circulation in Europe, but we have barriers. When you come to Europe, we are asked for very strange questions on the customs. Why? I hope to, before I die, and it's not a pessimistic view, but I hope before I die to have been able to travel between, for instance, Paris and Frankfurt, and Paris and Brussels, and being unable to notice where the borders are. And I think it's not at all impossible to do. You did it here. We did it in France. Until the First World War, there were a payment to enter into the major cities. When you went to Paris, you have les barrières d'octroi, and you have to pay duties. And now all this is abolished, and I hope we will be able to do so in Europe. We can also have common policies for the major sectors, like transportations, communications, energy, and financial services, in which absolutely no logics to have different legislations. I will also mention the agricultural policy, which must be perceived not as being a common agricultural policy, but just being the natural situation of any large area in which you have the production of farming products. I also hope that the time will come for a new approach on our problems of defense and on political unity. And I mentioned here, so I just will re-mention this, that I would like to see a emergency peacekeeping force, a European emergency peacekeeping force to be agreed on with a permanent staff and coordinated logistic, which could be used not to aggress others, because it's not our intention of the time, but to answer demands for peacekeeping purposes or for emergencies as declared by the international organization. I also think that we should have a fresh look at the nuclear strategy of Western Europe, which is a very delicate and significant problem for us. In the parliamentary field, because we will have elections, my suggestion would be that we should have a kind of shuttle between the national parliaments and the Strasbourg Parliament, the European parliaments, for all the major economic and financial legislation, to try to have the options and to have some legitimacy of his own will be a major contribution towards European unity. To end this conversation, I will tell you that an index which is published in Germany, West Germany, is for me a very significant one. Some of you know this index. It's what the Germans call the Angst Index. Oh, you look like speaking German. It's not the index of fear. Angst is a mixed word, it's anxiety and fear. And usually in index you ask what you think of Mr. Smith or Mr. Jones. Some people are in favor of criticizing him. It's not very significant. But the Angst Index, people answer this question. The existing political conditions in West Germany make you anxious or not? And if there was an Angst Index in the world today, the answer should be yes. The conditions make me anxious. And the joint purpose of the Western leaders should not be only to tackle with the problem as they come, but to have the idea to reinstall in our society a feeling of confidence and even expectation of the future. I remember very well, because I went through, when I was a boy, through the occupation, through the war. I remember very well what are the periods in which people are expecting something better. They are very happy periods. They could be period of hardships somewhere, difficulties, but people are expecting of what will come. And at the moment, I'm afraid that they have not a great confidence in the future. And the role of the leaders is to restore this confidence, to make people, the young, the old, the employed, the unemployed, the affluent, the poor, to feel that the future will bring to them something which is better than the present day. And so I expect that through the action of your school, through the research you are doing, you will help the future leader to improve the expectancy of what will come for the future people of the world. Thank you, Mr. Dick.
President Giscard d'Estaing has consented to answer a few questions tonight. So there are microphones on the ground floor at this microphone and that, and I think microphones on the second and perhaps the third floor as well. He's asked if I would recognize the persons asking the questions, and so if you would put your question succinctly, please, and then he will answer it. Yes, sir.
My question is this working?
Yes.
Oh, is this working? Okay, my question is, given the importance of the agricultural sector in both the economies of France and the United States, and given the period of difficulties we are encountering in trade, how would you propose that we could deal with this mutual, if temporary, problem of surpluses without draining each other's economies in the process of a trade war?
Well, if I knew the answer would be the most popular person in Europe and in America. But it is a major problem. I think that first we must accept that we have, and you have, a policy to protect the income of farmers. It is normal in the modern time that the farmers have a rather normal level of income. The problem is that we, to let them have this level of income, we use support for exports. And then we compete in a way which is first antagonizing us and also costing a very large amount of money because we are and you are subsidizing your exports. So my idea would be first to accept the fact that it's normal to have the support of farmers, which is described by your policy and the common agricultural policy. And then to enter into difficult agreements product by products and to see how is the way to handle certain items of the exports. And for instance, there was in the past an agreement on wheat, a world agreement on wheat. There could be an agreement on corn. There could be an agreement on barley, for instance, for some which are stable and products that could be stocked for a rather long period. But this should be distinct from the policy of support of the domestic prices. Because if there is a link between, we go into such pressure from the farming interest at home or here in the United States that is unworkable. And the extreme solution would be to have some joint approach, even joint instrument, to promoting export of certain commodities when they are of an homogeneous and common type. So this is my intermediary answer to your question.
Monsieur D'Estaing, do you think the anti-nuclear or zero-nuclear movements in Europe will have any considerable political or military influence in Europe? If so, in what ways? If not, why not?
Is there another question, Madam, on the same topic of nuclear deployment or not? to join to this question? No. I don't know exactly what your question is. There is a complicated strategic situation in Europe, which is due to the fact that the USSR has deployed a rather large numbers of a very accurate 3-warhead missiles known under the name of SS-20. The USSR started this a long time ago because it was denounced for the first time in 1977 by Chancellor Schmidt in London and gave no indication of interrupting the process. And this created a new imbalance in the nuclear forces in Europe. Not entirely new, because there were before some Soviet missiles, the S-4 and S-3, but they're obsolete now. And it's true also that the United States have some nuclear means in Western Europe, for instance, long-range bombers and some submarines cruising along the European coast. But on the whole, compared to the situation before, there is an imbalance. What should be understood by you is that these S-20 are typically the instrument of what we could call the Finlandization of Europe. It is not an instrument of war, because if there is a global war, all the panoply will be deployed, and then the decision will be taken by the major missiles launched by the USSR and the United States. But if there is a period of pressure on Western Europe, these SS-20, which are very accurate and devastating, and without any answer at the moment by the local European countries, are typically the instrument of blackmail, because any country submitted to that had the choice to die or to submit without creating a new risk for the USSR. So the rationale to deploy a new system of arms are very convincing. And so is the reason for which I share the view that these American missiles must be deployed. The point is that our final goal should be recognized as not being to win a war, but to keep the peace. And so the way we act, the way we speak, and even the way we develop should be harmonized by this will we have to keep the peace. And for that, I think that what was called the zero option was right at the beginning and wrong at the end, because it hasn't any credibility now. If you deal with someone, you must evaluate the credibility of what you suggest. In 1979, to say to the Soviet Union, we will deploy in 1983, except if in the 4 years to come you agree to destroy your own missiles, had a credibility. But the fact first that the Soviet Union went on deploying all the time, and that there has been a change in Soviet leadership makes impossible to believe today that between May and December the Soviet Union will accept to dismantle all its missiles. It's impossible for Mr. Andropov, being the new leader, to destroy all the power that has been built before him. So the credibility now is, I think, very limited. When there is no credibility, I go back to what I said to you before. People are afraid of manipulations. And they said, if you say so, you do not believe what you say. And so, rarely you intend to deploy, and you have no will to negotiate, because the negotiation is not credible. So my suggestion would be that now, it should be very clear that the deployment will take place, because there is no chance that an alternative solution could be found in the meantime. And it's certainly bad to let the temperature go and go, as if there was such a chance, and if the pressure should be useful for that. But at the same time, because I'm in favor not to win a war, but to keep the peace, to report, to transfer the credibility of the negotiation before the deployment to after. Because when the deployment will start, there will be room for negotiation. And we must be able to say to the Soviet Union that, well, we're deploying because you didn't meet our demands, not at all. But if you do, or if you enter during the 4 years of deployment, if you enter in a serious negotiation on a final joint level, we will consider this. We are not committed to go to the highest level if in the meantime there is a real willingness on your side to discuss and to agree an intermediary level, and then to agree on a parallel dismantling of the intermediary nuclear missiles. This is my point of view on this. And the public opinion of Europe, well, is preoccupied, which is very understandable. But by its vote, when you take the vote in Germany, the vote in Great Britain, the position in Italy, which is very interesting, because there was not a strong debate in Italy, which is an emotional country with a lot of political debates. It shows, well, you are smiling, but I'm a Latin myself, so I share this attitude. But it shows that the public opinion understands that there is a need for balance. But she demands, and I understand this, that in this research, normal research for balance, the final goal should be preservation of peace, and that the adequate movement and démarche should be engaged for this.
In 1982, the French government nationalized a number of major banks and companies. Do you think that these entities would be restored to private ownership if you were to return to power in 1988?
There are two questions. I just saw a sheet of paper when coming in the plane. It was distributed with a newspaper, showing the development of the banking system in Luxembourg. The number of foreign banks in Luxembourg now exceed 150. And they have assets which are the magnitude of the major West European banks. Why? Because when the regulations are too strict, or when the state presence is felt too strongly, banks' activities go somewhere else. So what happened is the fact that we took the risk to see the other banking system around us to develop and ours to shrink. I think that the opposition, I'm not speaking for myself because the French is not a personal property of anyone, the opposition will certainly reconsider this. And I hope it will do it in a way that will create first private ownership of the major banks, with possibly the exception of the banks that were nationalized before and which were the major deficit banks, but in an approach, in a way that will spread the ownership amongst a larger number of people. We had a problem in France that the ownership of the industries and banks and services were too concentrated, and so the denationalization should be used in a way that will share this ownership between a larger number of people.
Thank you.
On the first balcony here.
Yes. You said that the young are no longer in the political forefront. Assumedly they perhaps were in 1968. What do you think changed for students and youth in general?
What basically?
Students were in the forefront in 68, but you said that they're less in the forefront of the movement. Yes. What has changed?
Well, I suppose that it was on their behalf a rejection of the excesses of what they perceived as the excesses of the affluent society. It was a mixture. They were against certain methods in the university teaching and organization, which were more, as I mentioned, authoritarian, relying too much on hierarchy and too formal, and leaving too little room for self-expression and participation. That was one part. The other part was the desire, the confused desire for a society which was not entirely dominated by the method, the demand, and the attitude of the consumption society, at least in Europe. But since we entered in a much sober world in which the affluent society has evaporated, at least substantially, in which the main problems are now the problem of future employment and the place of the young student, the future societies, it's normal that their attitude have changed. When there are problems concerning the organization of the universities or the conception of their structure, they are still very vigilant, and they can react to any improper move concerning the organization or the life of the universities, and this is the present case.
I think this question will have to be the last question.
Thank you. I'm afraid that I might miss your next conversation. And I was just wondering if you could give us a few of your ideas briefly about the international monetary system and the revamping thereof.
Yeah, thank you. It interests me, and I hope I will convince all of you. I will try to be brief. I was a partner, I was present at the decision of devaluating the US dollar in 1971. I was present, I was a partner at the decision of letting the currencies float in 1973. Because the circumstances required such moves, the devaluation of the dollar because of you remember the situation, and the floating because the movement of speculation were so broad that it was impossible to control them without having the flotation. So for the crisis, I think that the system we used was probably the best for the crisis. And if we had tried to keep the fixed exchange rate system during the crisis, we should have failed. It was impossible. When the surplus of the oil countries was of the magnitude of $70 to $80 billion a year, when the amount of the euro-dollar liquidities were, as you know, a multiple of $100 billion, to have a fixed exchange rate system would have failed. And if we had tried, we would have engaged in the typical classical war, that is competitive devaluations. Each country devaluating against the other, all the time. And at the end, since this devaluation would have been frustrating by their results, it would have ended in a protectionism war. So I support the fact that we use a floating exchange rate system for the time of the crisis. But since we are now emerging of the oil crisis, we are not emerging of the structural crisis of some industrial sectors in your country, in Europe, but we are emerging of the oil crisis, and with a chance to move towards a more stable and equilibrated system. I think that the leaders should propose a goal. It's what I just mentioned as my conclusion. I don't think that the world could be happy without knowing where he goes. It's impossible. If you take the agents of the economy, the business leaders, the traders, even the people, the housewives, not to know. It's less important for you because you are living in a very large community. But if you take the people outside, not to know what the value of the main currencies will be, how to invest, how to buy, how to save. If you take the relationship, for instance, for the franc and the dollar, except the present excesses. We had a dollar at 4 francs for a dollar a few years ago. And we had a dollar at 6.80 under rather normal conditions. How to invest? How to compete? So I think that the goal should be to return to a fixed exchange rate system. And I will be criticized by many people here, calling them experts in the monetary system. But they will forget that the floating exchange rate system in the history of the world has been linked to crisis. Up to the First World War, a fixed exchange rate system with all the industrialization in the world, with different conditions in America, in Europe, in Great Britain, in other countries. And before the two wars, the flotation started with the crisis. And after the war, we had between 58, because before there was no convertibility of the currency, so it was not a genuine period, a genuine example, but between 58 up to the 70s, we have a stable exchange rate system, and we had a major expansion at that time. So to say now that we will keep as a goal a pure floating system in which a calculation will be impossible, in which the evaluation of the future will be left to some uncertain forces, I think will not meet the demand, the basic needs of the people. And so my case is not a technical one. In a community in which 99% of the population would be composed of bankers, there wouldn't be major differences, because bankers could adjust to any system. But this is not the case. You have producers, you have traders, you have savers, you have just ordinary people. They want to know. The difficulty is that the major imbalances still existing do not make credible a fast return to fixed exchange rates. And these major imbalances are the importance of the American budget deficit, the doubt about the final level of oil prices, and also the divergence between some of the economic policies of major European countries. But if we fix as a goal, a final goal, a fixed exchange rate system, which should give us a period to heal the wounds, to cure the evils. And how to do this? By a progressive evolution, which is also linked to my personal philosophy. I think that the modern attitude is what I would call a pragmatic, rational way of doing things. You fix a goal, and then you take a pragmatic approach to reach it. For instance, to let the market forces find the rates slowly, to help them to coagulate progressively, to intervene first with very broad margin, and then to reduce the margin. And if it works, then in 3 years or 5 years, to enter into a formal negotiation to organize rationally and through a mutual agreement the system. And I know that this idea will not be easily received. I'm absolutely convinced that in the years to come, it will be the final decision that the international community will take. Thank you, Mr. Dean, again.
That's an excellent answer as well.
How do we go on?
Bill, thank you here. To say just once again how much we appreciate having President Giscard d'Estaing here, and how much we look forward to his coming back next year or at the next time of his convenience to give us the second conversation. Thank you.